I'm sorry, we're going to have to ask you to stop. Rachel Green, 29-year-old events manager at the Ivory Room, a mid-sized music venue on Carnaby Street in London, pressed her earpiece and walked toward the small side stage with the expression of someone delivering news they genuinely did not want to deliver. It was a Friday evening in March 2005. Carnaby Street outside was vivid and alive. Shop fronts lit in bright yellow and white. Pedestrians in colorful spring jackets moving under strings of warm amber lights hung between the buildings, the whole street carrying that particular Friday evening energy that makes London feel like the most alive city on earth. Inside the Ivory Room, the atmosphere was different. The main hall was set for a charity concert, round tables dressed in deep royal purple linen, tall centerpieces with vivid orange and yellow flowers, candles in amber glass holders throwing warm gold light across the room, 400 seats filled with an audience that had paid generously to be there. The stage at the front of the room was properly lit. A warm wash of amber and gold stage lighting falling on a single microphone stand, a piano to the left, a guitar amplifier to the right. The side stage, where Rachel was now walking, was a different matter entirely. Daniel Ashworth, 34 years old, was sitting on a folding chair in the small corridor behind the main stage with a battered acoustic guitar across his knee and his head in his hands. He was supposed to have been the opening act. He had been the opening act for approximately 4 minutes before the sound system feeding his guitar to the main hall had failed completely. A feedback loop that had produced a sound somewhere between a dentist's drill and a fire alarm, causing 400 formally dressed guests to cover their ears simultaneously. The sound engineer had cut the feed. The stage manager had come to Daniel and told him they couldn't fix it in time. Rachel had been sent to officially end his evening. Daniel had been trying to break through as a musician for 11 years. He had a voice that music producers who heard it described as genuinely extraordinary, warm and raw and specific in the way that only real voices are, the kind of voice that makes people stop what they are doing. He had written 3 albums that nobody had distributed, played 300 small venues across England that had given him experience and very little else, and spent 11 years believing that the next thing would be the thing that changed everything. Tonight was supposed to have been that thing, a charity concert in front of 400 influential people, organized by a music industry contact who had finally gotten him on a bill that mattered. And the sound system had failed in the 4th minute. Rachel reached the side stage corridor. She looked at Daniel with genuine sympathy. "I'm so sorry," she said. "We just can't get it back in time. The main act goes on in 20 minutes. Daniel nodded without lifting his head. "It's fine," he said, in the voice of someone for whom it was absolutely not fine, but who had run out of ways to say so. What neither Rachel nor Daniel knew was that the corridor behind the main stage connected directly to the venue's private hospitality suite, and that the door to that suite was slightly open, and that 2 men inside it had heard the feedback collapse 20 minutes earlier and had been listening to the conversation through the gap ever since. The door opened. The first man through it was tall and angular, wearing a perfectly fitted emerald green velvet blazer over a crisp white shirt, his silver blonde hair swept back from his face, large tinted glasses in bright, cobalt blue frames catching the corridor light, multiple rings on both hands, an energy that filled any room he entered before he had said a single word. Elton John, 57 years old, stood in the doorway of the hospitality suite with a glass of champagne in one hand and an expression on his face that Rachel would later describe as the look of a man who had already made a decision and was simply now executing it. Behind him, moving with the unhurried ease of someone who has never once in his life rushed anywhere, came Keith Richards, 61 years old, wearing a vivid royal blue silk shirt open at the collar over slim black trousers, his wild silver-streaked dark hair falling in every direction, heavy silver rings stacked on every finger, a cigarette behind his left ear, his deeply lined face carrying its permanent expression of amused and absolute authority. Daniel looked up. Rachel stopped breathing for a moment. Elton John looked at Daniel Ashworth sitting on the folding chair with his battered acoustic guitar and said, without preamble, "We heard you before the system went, the 4 minutes before it blew." He paused. "Your voice is something." Daniel stared at him. "The sound system failed," Keith said from behind Elton, his voice low and graveled, studying the battered acoustic guitar on Daniel's knee with the evaluating eye of someone who has spent 60 years understanding exactly what a guitar can tell you about the person holding it. The voice didn't. Rachel found enough of herself to speak. "Gentlemen, the main act goes on in 20. "We know," Elton said pleasantly. He turned to Rachel with the warm, implacable courtesy of a man who has been getting his own way for 40 years without ever being rude about it. "Give us 15 minutes with him, please." Rachel looked at her clipboard, then at Elton John, then at Keith Richards, then back at her clipboard, which suddenly seemed very small and very irrelevant. 15 minutes, she said. What happened in that corridor in the next 15 minutes was not witnessed by 400 people. It was witnessed by Rachel Green, one sound engineer who happened to walk past and then walked very slowly and then stopped entirely, and a catering assistant named Priya who had come to collect empty glasses from the hospitality suite, and instead stood completely still with a tray of glasses in her hands for 12 minutes. Elton John sat down on a second folding chair, crossed one leg over the other, and said to Daniel, "Play me something. Not for them, for us, right here." Daniel looked at the two men in front of him, Elton John in his emerald blazer and cobalt blue glasses, Keith Richards in his royal blue silk shirt with his silver rings and his cigarette behind his ear, and did something that took more courage than anything he had done on a stage in 11 years. He played, right there in the corridor. No microphone, no amplifier, no audience, just his battered acoustic guitar and his voice in a narrow backstage corridor with bad lighting and empty glasses on a catering tray. He played an original song, a song he had written in his kitchen at 2 in the morning after a show in Wolverhampton where 12 people had shown up and 3 had left early. A song about keeping going when keeping going makes no rational sense. His voice in that corridor, with no system and no reverb and no production of any kind, was exactly what the music producer had once told him it was, warm and raw and specific and completely, undeniably real. Elton John did not move for the entire 3 minutes and 40 seconds of that song. Keith Richards, leaning against the corridor wall with his arms folded, his silver rings catching the dim backstage light, watched Daniel with the expression he reserves for things he considers genuinely worth his attention, a slight narrowing of the heavy-lidded eyes, a stillness in his face that is the opposite of boredom. When Daniel finished, the corridor was silent. Then Elton uncrossed his legs, leaned forward, and said, "What are you doing next Wednesday?" Daniel blinked. Nothing. Why?" "Because," Elton John said, "I have a session booked at AIR Studios and my producer needs to hear that voice and that song." He looked at Keith. "Don't you think?" Keith Richards pushed off from the wall, walked over to Daniel, and held out his hand. Daniel shook it, the silver rings cool and heavy against his palm. 11 years is long enough to wait," Keith said simply. "Time to stop waiting." Rachel Green, standing at the end of the corridor with her clipboard pressed against her chest, watched Elton John take out his phone and type a number into it and hand it to Daniel Ashworth, who was sitting on a folding chair in a backstage corridor with a battered guitar on his knee and tears running freely and completely, unashamedly down his face. The main act went on 8 minutes late. Nobody complained. And the following Wednesday, Daniel Ashworth walked into AIR Studios in London and recorded the song he had written at 2 in the morning in his kitchen, and Elton John's producer sat behind the mixing desk and took off his headphones after the first take and said 4 words that Daniel had waited 11 years to hear. That was the one.